The world is divided by borders that at first glance appear to be just lines on a map. But what many don't know is that behind these borders, there is an imminent danger, a real time bomb ready to explode. Countries that live in constant tension, territories marked by wars, power disputes, and historical issues that remain unresolved. While you go about your day, millions of people live under the shadow of these dangerous borders. You're about to discover how these conflicts can affect the fate of the entire planet, and understand why these borders are much more than territorial divisions. Get ready for a journey through some of the most explosive zones in the world, where danger is always lurking, and the story has never been more urgent to be told. Borders are more than invisible lines. They are deep scars on the earth and in people's minds. In an increasingly interconnected world, these divisions continue to be visible reminders of conflicts, disputes, and power struggles. Each border brings with it ancient stories of wars, agreements, and battles for territories that shaped nations. And in the middle of these divisions are human lives, people who cross these lines daily, facing challenges that go beyond common understanding. But not all borders are equal. Some remain relatively peaceful, while others simmer with tensions that could explode at any moment. What makes these lines ticking time bombs is rooted in history, politics, and cultural divisions. It's as if there is an invisible countdown, where every move or decision can trigger a conflict of devastating proportions. This danger, often silent, defines the fate of millions of lives. Imagine living in the shadow of a border that could become the scene of a global conflict. The anxiety is palpable. The fear is constant. For many, this is a daily reality. From children playing in the streets, ignorant of the imminent danger, to political leaders negotiating at conference tables, everyone has a role in this delicate scenario. But what is really behind these tense borders? What makes them so dangerous? These are the questions we will explore. Understanding what is at stake is the first step. Each tension-filled border has its own complex history, and by unraveling it, we are able to see beyond the news and political speeches. Let's then begin this journey through some of the most dangerous borders in the world, where curiosity about countries leads us to discover impressive stories and realities that few dare to face. The history of borders is as old as humanity itself. Since the first settlements, human beings have always delimited territories, seeking to protect their resources and control who entered and left their lands. But these divisions, which at first were simple fences or mountains, evolved into something much more complex over the centuries. The Great Wars, especially those of the 20th century, redefined entire maps, drawing borders that to this day carry deep marks of suffering and division. After the First and Second World Wars, the world saw the rise of new nations and the collapse of empires. International politics has become a game of chess, where every line drawn on the map could mean peace or war. The division of Germany, the creation of Israel, and the independence of several African nations are just a few examples of how these borders have been redrawn. And each of these changes brought with it new tensions, new challenges, leaving a trail of latent conflicts. Colonialism, in turn, left an indelible scar on modern borders. European powers drew artificial lines across continents like Africa and the Middle East, often without any consideration for the people and cultures who live there. The result was a series of borders that, instead of uniting, divided ethnicities, tribes, and religions, planting the seeds of conflicts that persist to this day. Where there was once harmony, colonialism left a legacy of hatred and distrust. And these borders created by wars and colonialism don't just affect the countries in question. They have shaped global geopolitics, directly impacting the lives of millions of people. Each line drawn on the map has a history, a reason, and an impact that reverberates to this day. Understanding this history is essential to understanding the tensions that still simmer in many parts of the world. What lies behind these borders that continue to divide nations and cultures? Colonialism was a devastating force that over the centuries left deep marks in different parts of the world. When European powers divided up territories in Africa and the Middle East, they often did so without considering the cultural and religious identities that already existed there. This imposition of artificial borders generated a series of conflicts that tragically still echo today. Colonialism, with its arbitrary decisions, transformed communities that previously coexisted peacefully into mortal enemies. In Africa, the impact was immense. Tribes that historically had a cooperative relationship found themselves separated by invisible borders, while enemies were forced to coexist within new countries created by colonizers. This not only divided families and cultures, but sowed the seeds of civil wars and genocides that devastated the continent. The conflict in Rwanda, for example, is one of the darkest legacies of these artificial borders, where the ethnic division between Tutsis and Hutus was accentuated by Belgian colonialism. In the Middle East, the scenario was not very different. Borders drawn without taking into account sectarian tensions between Sunnis, Shiites, and other religious groups fueled conflicts that persist to this day. The borders of Iraq and Syria, for example, were drawn in a way that created internal divisions that facilitated foreign intervention and political instability. And the fight for territories, power, and control of resources continues to be a dangerous game for millions of people living in these regions. With the end of colonialism, many countries gained their independence, but inherited borders continue to be a source of dispute. The struggle for land and national identity, amplified by colonial borders, remains alive and well. Those who pay the price are the populations that find themselves trapped in this political game, where curiosity about countries reveals tragic stories of separation and conflict. How do these artificial borders continue to incite wars and tensions in the 21st century? In the heart of the Korean Peninsula, there is an invisible line, but so powerful that it shapes the lives of millions of people: the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. This border, one of the most guarded in the world, is the remnant of a war that never really ended. In 1953, a ceasefire was declared, but never a peace treaty. And so, to this day, the two Koreas live in a constant state of tension, separated by a line full of uncertainty and fear. The demilitarized zone, known as the DMZ, is a territory where danger lurks at every turn. Mined and patrolled by soldiers from both sides, this strip of land symbolizes the fragile peace that separates North and South. Political differences between the two nations are stark, and the threat of military escalation is ever present. North Korea's authoritarian regime, with its nuclear weapons and aggressive rhetoric, keeps the world on alert, while South Korea, with its economic growth, strengthens itself as a modern power. But the scars of this division are not limited to geopolitics. Families were separated by this impenetrable border, with siblings and parents living completely different lives on opposite sides. The pain of not being able to cross that line to reunite with loved ones is a reality that few in the West can understand. The fear of an armed conflict, combined with the sadness of separation, forms a picture of silent despair that haunts the daily lives of those who live under the shadow of this border. The tension between the Koreas does not just affect the region. Any poorly calculated move could involve powers like the United States and China, turning this local dispute into a global conflict. Curiosity about countries like North Korea reveals much more than a closed regime, exposes the reality of a world where borders become the stage for a constant battle between power, fear, and hope. How far can this tension go before it explodes? In the foothills of the Himalayas, Kashmir stands as a land of extraordinary beauty and profound conflict. The line of control separating India and Pakistan is one of the most tense points on the planet, where the silence can be broken at any moment by the sound of gunfire. Since the independence and division of India in 1947, the two countries have faced each other over possession of this mountainous region, a dispute that has cost countless lives and keeps the world on alert for a possible nuclear confrontation. The conflict in Kashmir is as old as the nations involved. Divided by territorial, cultural, and religious issues, this region is the center of a dispute that involves much more than land. Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan see Kashmir not just as a piece of territory, but as a symbol of power and national identity. And in the middle of this war of ideologies and beliefs are ordinary people, whose lives are impacted by a war that seems to have no end. What makes this border even more dangerous is the fact that both countries have nuclear weapons. The possibility of a conflict turning into a nuclear war is a real fear, which reverberates throughout the international community. Tension is constant, and any small escalation can lead to devastating consequences, not just for Kashmir, but for the world. For civilians living in the region, every day is a fight for survival, in a scenario where peace seems like a distant dream. Curiosity about countries like India and Pakistan reveals a complexity of tensions that goes beyond physical borders. The line of control in Kashmir is a vivid example of how a territorial division can turn into a powder keg. The stories of resistance, suffering, and hope that emerge from this land show how borders can define the destiny of millions. Will this dispute ever find a peaceful resolution? In one of the most sacred and disputed regions in the world, Israel and Palestine fight for more than land. They fight for identity, history, and survival. Since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, this land has been the scene of wars, intifadas, and failed negotiations. The border between the two peoples is not just physical, but a barrier of hatred and resentment that has strengthened over the decades. Every stone on this earth carries a story of faith, blood, and division. At the center of this dispute is Jerusalem, the holy city for Jews, Muslims, and Christians. The question of who has rights over the city has been one of the biggest points of tension. For Israelis, Jerusalem is the historic and indivisible capital of the State of Israel. For Palestinians, it is the capital of a future independent state. And in the midst of all this tension, walls were built, settlements were erected, and the separation between the two peoples became increasingly concrete, both physically and emotionally. The construction of Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories is one of the most controversial issues. These colonies, seen as illegal by the international community, expand the Israeli occupation and make the search for a peaceful solution even more difficult. The lives of Palestinians, in turn, are marked by checkpoints, blockades, and restrictions on movement, making everyday life a true battlefield. And every day, the hope of a peaceful solution seems more distant. Curiosity about countries like Israel and Palestine reveals a reality of conflicts that goes beyond the headlines. The fight for land and identity turns this region into one of the most tense places on the planet. The question that hangs in the air is whether it will ever be possible for peaceful coexistence between two peoples who share so much but remain deeply divided. What does the future hold for this sacred land and its inhabitants? The Middle East is a region where borders are constantly shifting, an area where maps never seem to be complete. The collapse of nations like Syria and Iraq, torn apart by civil wars, and the rise of the Islamic State, has brutally redrawn borders. What were once stable lines are now war zones, where factions fight for territorial control, power, and influence. These collapsing borders are a reflection of a region disintegrating before our eyes, as international powers vie for its interests. The Islamic State at its height challenged the idea of established borders, proclaiming a caliphate that crossed territorial boundaries and dismantled what was left of nations. Syria and Iraq, ancient centers of civilizations, have been devastated, their populations forced to migrate, their cities turned into rubble. Foreign powers such as the United States and Russia entered the conflict, seeking to protect their interests as the fate of the region became increasingly complicated. And, in the midst of this chaos, new frontiers emerge, drawn by violence and despair. Foreign intervention has shaped the fate of the Middle East's borders. Russia's influence in Syria, the United States' role in Iraq, and alliances between neighboring countries further complicate the scenario. The collapse of traditional borders has opened space for new disputes, where power is fragmented between different groups, each with their own agenda. The geopolitics of this region is a complex dance, where each movement can radically change the future of millions of people. Curiosity about countries in the Middle East shows us that the region is constantly in flux. Collapsing borders are evidence that the past still weighs heavily on the present. And the future? How will it be shaped by these conflicting powers, by these lines that can no longer contain tensions? What does the collapse of these borders mean for global stability? African borders are a painful legacy of colonialism, and many of them remain as deep scars on the continent. Drawn during the Berlin Conference at the end of the 19th century, these borders did not respect local cultures, ethnicities, or traditions. It was as if arbitrary lines were drawn on a map, separating tribes and uniting groups that had never coexisted peacefully. The result? A continent where borders not only divide lands, but also incite conflicts that reverberate to this day. Africa, a mosaic of cultures, ethnicities, and tribes, saw these colonial divisions transform it into a land of bloody conflicts. The civil war in Sudan, the genocide in Rwanda, the tensions in Burundi. All of these conflicts are fueled by artificial borders that, instead of uniting, have divided nations. And tribalism, accentuated by these divisions, continues to be a source of tension, making it difficult to build lasting peace. Colonial borders, far from disappearing, have become symbols of pain and suffering. Rwanda, one of the most tragic examples, illustrates how these divisions can lead to catastrophic consequences. The genocide of 1994, which left more than 800,000 people dead, was a direct reflection of ethnic tensions exacerbated by colonial divisions. But Africa is also a resilient continent, where people struggle daily to overcome the wounds left by these borders. Reconstruction, both physical and social, is a constant struggle, a battle to erase the scars of an oppressive colonial past. Curiosity about African countries reveals a vibrant continent, but marked by borders that should never have existed. How can these divisions be overcome? Is there a path to peace on a continent where borders still dictate the fate of millions of people? What can Africa teach us about resistance in the face of imposed divisions? The border between the United States and Mexico is one of the most symbolic in the world, a line that separates two completely different realities. On one side, the economic power of the United States. On the other, the struggle of millions of Mexicans in search of a better life. In the midst of this tension, the wall that rises between the two countries is a physical manifestation of migration policies, economic divisions, and ideological debates. But this wall, which stretches for hundreds of kilometers, represents much more than a simple physical barrier. The immigration crisis on the border between the United States and Mexico is a constant reality. Every day, thousands of people try to cross this border, often risking their lives in search of an opportunity. The wall, seen by some as a security measure, is for others a symbol of oppression and exclusion. And as U.S. policy tightens on immigration, tensions in border cities continue to rise, fueled by the presence of drug cartels and the violence that plagues these regions. The border between these two countries is not only physical, but also economic and cultural. For the United States, immigration control is seen as a matter of national security, especially with the increased presence of criminal groups in border regions. For Mexico, the border is a line that separates millions of citizens from the opportunity for a better life. The impact of this divide is felt on both sides, with families separated, lives at risk, and a growing sense of uncertainty about the future. Curiosity about countries like the United States and Mexico leads us to question how these borders became so loaded with meaning. What does the wall really represent? And will one day this line stop being a physical and emotional barrier and become a symbol of union and cooperation? How far does the tension go between these two countries, whose histories are so deeply intertwined? In the heart of the Caucasus, the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the Nagorno-Karabakh region has raged for decades, marked by cycles of violence and ceasefires. Nagorno-Karabakh, a mountainous area with an Armenian majority but located within the territory of Azerbaijan, has become a symbol of the rivalry between the two countries. This territorial conflict, which dates back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, is not just a dispute over land, but over identity, culture, and survival. The origin of this conflict is complex and deeply rooted in the history of the region. During the Soviet era, Nagorno-Karabakh was administered as an autonomous region within Azerbaijan, despite its majority Armenian population. When the Soviet Union collapsed, ethnic and territorial tensions came to the surface, culminating in a devastating war in the early 90s. Since then, this area has been a zone of constant conflict, where the ceasefire is always fragile and peace seems like a distant mirage. The lives of the people who inhabit Nagorno-Karabakh are suspended in a limbo of uncertainty. For the Armenians who live there, the region is part of their identity and history, and they are willing to fight to maintain it. For Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh is a lost territory, which must be recovered at all costs. The recent intensification of fighting in Dois Milivento has shown that this wound is still open, and any attempt at a peaceful resolution is quickly overshadowed by violence. Curiosity about countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan reveals a scenario where borders are not just lines on the map, but battlefields for the soul of a nation. What does this dispute mean for the future of the region? And will Nagorno-Karabakh ever find peace, or will it continue to be a point of contention that threatens to destabilize the entire Caucasus area? In the modern world, physical borders are no longer the only battlefield. Global terrorism has transformed the concept of conflict, making territorial divisions irrelevant to extremist groups acting across borders. The power of organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State is not limited to one region or country, but spreads through clandestine networks that cross continents. This new type of war, without clear limits, has radically changed the way nations deal with security and sovereignty. Terrorist actions completely ignore established borders, which is why the fight against terrorism requires unprecedented international cooperation. Since the Nov 11 attacks, the world has mobilized to contain this global threat. But, despite efforts, attacks continue, turning entire cities into terror scenes where safety can never be guaranteed. And as nations try to protect their borders, terrorism finds new ways to infiltrate, using technology and the internet to spread its fear and chaos. Curiosity about countries involved in this fight against terrorism shows us a reality where virtual borders have become as important as physical ones. Conflicts move to cyberspace, where hackers and extremist groups attack critical infrastructures of enemy nations. Cyber warfare is a frightening reality, where control of data and systems can be as destructive as physical violence. The future of borders, both physical and digital, is being shaped by these new types of conflict. Global terrorism challenges the sovereignty of nations and the security of their populations. How can borders adapt to this new era, where enemies are invisible and can attack from anywhere in the world? Will these threats ever be contained, or are we destined to live in a state of constant alert, with borders increasingly difficult to secure? In the Caucasus Mountains, a disputed border between Georgia and Russia remains a point of constant tension. The War of 2008, although brief, left deep marks on the region, with the Russian occupation of Georgian territories such as Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These areas, which seek independence, are at the center of a geopolitical dispute that involves much more than territorial issues. Russian influence over these regions echoes the ancient power game between great powers, and the struggle for autonomy in these areas is a reflection of a nation in search of its own identity. The war between Georgia and Russia was a brutal reminder that the borders in the Caucasus are far from stable. The conflict resulted in the occupation of part of Georgian territory, and tensions continue to simmer just below the surface. Abkhazia and South Ossetia, with Russia's support, call for independence, while Georgia struggles to maintain its sovereignty. The Russian military presence in the region is a clear sign that Moscow still views the Caucasus as part of its sphere of influence, and any attempt to challenge this reality could have serious consequences. For people living in these regions, the reality is one of uncertainty and instability. The War of 2008 may be over, but peace is still far away. The presence of Russian troops, the desire for independence in separatist regions, and international pressure on Russia create a scenario of constant tension. Georgia's borders remain fragile, and the risk of new conflicts remains a concern for the international community. Curiosity about countries like Georgia and Russia reveals how the borders of the Caucasus are much more than lines on a map. They are symbols of the struggle for identity, power, and autonomy. What is the future of these borders? And will tensions between Georgia and Russia ever find a peaceful resolution? Or will we always be on the brink of a new conflict in this mountainous and volatile region? Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was one of the most defining moments in recent international politics. The world watched, perplexed, as Russia took control of the Ukrainian peninsula, in a move that reconfigured Europe's borders and reignited tensions that seemed dormant since the end of the Cold War. Crimea, with its strategic location and historical importance, became the focal point of a conflict that, to this day, shapes the region's geopolitics and challenges the limits of international law. The annexation of Crimea was quick, but the consequences reverberate to this day. Ukraine, which lost vital and symbolic territory, continues to struggle to regain control of the region, while Russia strengthens its military presence there. The conflict in eastern Ukraine, with Russian-backed separatist groups, is a direct extension of this dispute over Crimea. Hybrid warfare, marked by disinformation, cyber attacks, and clandestine support, has become the new face of a conflict that challenges traditional borders. People living in Crimea face a divided reality. Many Ukrainians who remained in the region find themselves under the control of a country to which they do not feel they belong, while others have embraced the change, recognizing Russia as their new homeland. Cultural, political, and social tensions are palpable, and the future of the peninsula remains uncertain. What was once a clear border between Ukraine and Russia is now a blurred line, where the dispute over territorial control is constant. Curiosity about countries like Ukraine and Russia reveals how this border, shaped by the annexation of Crimea, continues to be one of the biggest challenges to peace in Europe. How will this dispute evolve? Will Crimea remain under Russian control, or will it one day return to Ukraine? The answer to these questions is crucial to understanding the future of European borders and the stability of the region. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia is not limited to Crimea. The tensions unfolding on the border between these two countries continue to challenge Europe's stability and international order. Since 2014, the war in eastern Ukraine, driven by Russian-backed separatist groups, has devastated the region, creating an unstable and dangerous border. This dispute goes far beyond physical borders. It is a struggle for power, influence, and the geopolitical future of Eastern Europe. The possibility of an escalation of this conflict is a constant concern for the international community. With the sanctions imposed on Russia and attempts at dialogue, the situation on the border remains tense. Any poorly calculated move could lead to a greater confrontation, directly involving other world powers. And meanwhile, life in Ukraine's border cities remains marked by uncertainty, with civilians trying to survive amid seemingly never-ending bombings and military occupations. The future of this border is deeply linked to the role of Western powers and their responses to Russian actions. NATO, the United States, and the European Union play a crucial role in trying to contain Russian ambitions and guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty. Economic sanctions and strategic alliances are part of a complex power game, where Ukraine's borders are at stake. The outcome of this conflict will define not only the fate of Ukraine, but the balance of power across the region. Curiosity about countries like Ukraine and Russia makes us reflect on the global impact of their unstable borders. Will the world see a peaceful resolution to this conflict, or are we on the brink of a new era of tension and division in Europe? What does the future hold for the border between Ukraine and Russia? And how will it shape global geopolitics in the coming years? In the far north of the planet, a new frontier of conflict is emerging: the Arctic. For centuries, this region was isolated and inhospitable, a vast expanse of ice seemingly untouched by geopolitics. But as polar ice caps melt due to climate change, the Arctic has become a field of contention among nations seeking to control its rich natural resources and new shipping routes. What was once a frozen border is now transforming into one of the most complex and tense scenarios in modern geopolitics. The fight for control of oil, natural gas, and minerals in the Arctic has intensified in recent years. Russia, the United States, Canada, Norway, and Denmark are some of the nations that claim parts of this vast region, seeking to expand their exclusive economic zones. The Arctic, once seen as a no-man's land, is now home to increasing militarization, with submarines and warships patrolling its icy waters. The conflict, although still silent, can quickly escalate as resources become increasingly valuable. The militarization of the region is a clear sign that world powers are willing to defend their interests in the Arctic at any cost. The Russian presence in the area has been particularly notable, with Moscow expanding its military bases and claiming territories beyond its traditional borders. At the same time, the United States and its allies closely monitor every move, fearing that control of the Arctic could give Russia a global strategic advantage. In this scenario, peace in the Arctic depends on a delicate diplomatic dance, where the balance of power is constantly tested. Curiosity about countries competing in this region leads us to question: to what extent will climate change shape these new frontiers? How will these nations find a balance between their economic interests and the preservation of one of the most fragile regions on the planet? The Arctic, a once frozen frontier, is thawing not just physically, but geopolitically, and the world is watching with bated breath to see what comes next. In the icy heights of the Himalayas, one of the highest and most inhospitable borders in the world, India and China face off in a dispute that seems as old as the mountains that separate them. The military confrontation in the Ladakh region, which has intensified in recent years, is just the latest episode in a long history of rivalry between two nuclear powers. Skirmishes on the icy slopes are a constant reminder that despite diplomatic advances, the India-China border remains a point of extreme tension. The conflict in the Himalayas has deep roots. Since the 60s, when the two countries fought a brief war, the border has never been fully resolved. The current line of control, known as the Line of Effective Control, is a disputed territory where neither side gives in and both sides constantly increase their military presence. The scenario is of armed soldiers in strategic positions, ready for any possible escalation. For residents of nearby villages, this tension is a part of everyday life, a constant reminder that peace is fragile. Tibet's role in this conflict is central. For India, Tibet has invaluable strategic value, not only as a natural barrier, but also as a political issue. For China, control of Tibet is a matter of sovereignty and power. This disagreement over the role of Tibet and the region's borders further intensifies the conflict in the Himalayas. The majestic landscape hides a dispute that involves much more than territorial issues. It is a battle for influence and power in Asia. Curiosity about countries like India and China leads us to reflect on how this frozen frontier, apparently so distant, can have global implications. How far can this dispute escalate before a resolution is reached? Will the Himalayas, with all their grandeur, continue to be the scene of tensions between two of the greatest powers in the world? The future of this border may well define the balance of power in Asia. In the heart of the South China Sea, a dispute over small islands hides a geopolitical battle of enormous proportions. These islands, which at first may seem insignificant, are actually crucial strategic points for controlling maritime routes and valuable natural resources such as oil and gas. China, with its growing military presence in the region, claims a large part of these waters, which has generated a firm response from neighboring countries such as Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, which also claim sovereignty over parts of the sea. The Chinese military presence on artificial islands built along the South China Sea has alarmed the international community. Beijing has transformed reefs and atolls into fortified military bases, with airstrips, radar systems, and heavy weaponry. This move not only challenges the claims of neighboring countries, but also puts freedom of navigation on one of the most important trade routes in the world at risk. The militarization of the islands is a stark reminder that naval power is still a key player in modern geopolitics. For countries in the region, Chinese advance represents a threat to sovereignty and security. The Philippines, for example, took the case to the International Tribunal in The Hague, which ruled against China's claims. However, Beijing rejected the verdict, continuing to expand its military presence. The role of the United States in this dispute is also crucial, as Washington has reaffirmed its commitment to maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, carrying out naval patrols and demonstrating strength in the region. Curiosity about countries involved in this dispute reveals a reality where control of the sea is much more than a territorial issue. It's a contest for global influence, where the balance of power in the Pacific is at stake. How far does China's ambition to control these waters go? And how can neighboring countries allied to the United States react to this growing militarization? The future of the South China Sea remains uncertain, but one thing is clear. This dispute will shape the Asian geopolitical landscape for many years to come. South Sudan, the youngest country in the world, was born amid promises of freedom and hope, but was soon plunged into a devastating cycle of civil war and conflict. When it gained its independence from Sudan in 2011, many hoped that the new country would finally be able to forge its own path. However, internal divisions, ethnic disputes, and control of natural resources, especially oil, quickly turned this border into a battlefield where peace always seems out of reach. The fight for independence was long and brutal, and South Sudan emerged as a fragile nation with a devastated infrastructure and an economy dependent on oil. The border between Sudan and South Sudan continues to be a point of tension, especially in the oil-rich areas where both countries claim control. Furthermore, South Sudan's internal border itself is marked by conflicts between ethnic groups who fight for power and scarce resources, further aggravating the humanitarian crisis in the region. Control of oil is central to understanding the conflict. Oil reserves are mainly located in South Sudan, but the infrastructure to export it passes through Sudan, creating interdependence between the two countries. This situation has fueled mistrust and constant disputes, making the border an area of permanent instability. For the local population, living close to the border is synonymous with uncertainty and violence, where access to basic resources such as water and food is a daily challenge. Curiosity about countries like South Sudan reveals the fragility of a newly born country where borders are still being defined amid bloody conflicts. What does the future hold for this nation? Is it possible to build lasting peace in a country so young and already so marked by war? South Sudan continues to fight for its identity and survival, on a border that symbolizes how arduous the path to freedom can be. The border between Colombia and Venezuela, one of the longest in Latin America, has become a symbol of the crisis plaguing the region. With Venezuela's economic and political collapse, this border became the scene of one of the continent's biggest humanitarian crises. Millions of Venezuelans crossed into Colombia, fleeing hunger, lack of medicine, and violence. The continuous flow of refugees has transformed the border into a zone of tension, where insecurity, smuggling, and the presence of armed groups further complicate the situation. The impact of this crisis is felt in both Venezuela and Colombia. For Colombia, the arrival of millions of refugees represents an immense humanitarian challenge, with border cities overwhelmed by a growing population and scarcity of resources. Furthermore, the border is fertile ground for the increased presence of guerrillas, paramilitary groups, and drug cartels, which take advantage of the chaos to expand their illicit activities. The Colombian government struggles to maintain security, but border areas are often beyond its control. In Venezuela, the government of Nicolás Maduro faces increasing pressure, both internally and internationally, to resolve the crisis. However, attempts at dialogue with the opposition have repeatedly failed, and the economy continues to be in free fall. The border with Colombia, once a vibrant trade zone, is now an open wound, where the desperation of those fleeing contrasts with the violence of those seeking to profit from the chaos. Security in this region is precarious, and the hope of a peaceful solution seems increasingly distant. Curiosity about countries like Colombia and Venezuela shows us how a border can become a symbol of crisis and suffering. Will this border one day return to being a point of cooperation and prosperity? Or will it be forever marked by the shadow of the Venezuelan crisis and the collapse of a once prosperous country? The answers to these questions will shape the future of Latin America and the relationship between these two neighboring nations. The Balkans, a region with a history marked by divisions and disputes, continue to be a scene of latent tensions, even decades after the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. The Balkan borders, redrawn over centuries of war and conflict, bear deep scars that still affect the region's nations. Although open clashes have ceased, tensions between the different ethnicities and nations of the Balkans remain, and the risk of new conflicts still haunts the future of this highly fragmented region. The war in Bosnia, the struggle for independence in Kosovo, and the conflicts in Croatia and Serbia are vivid reminders of a recent past that left its mark on all Balkan nations. These borders, often drawn along ethnic and religious lines, continue to be a source of controversy. The Kosovo region, for example, is still a point of contention between Serbia and the rest of the international community, and the fight for recognition and sovereignty continues to cause border tensions. The breakup of Yugoslavia not only created new nations, but also stirred up old rivalries. Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia, although now independent countries, still bear the weight of the wars that divided their populations. The borders of these nations, often marked by the destruction of villages and towns, are reminders that the conflicts in the Balkans have never been fully resolved. Peace, although present, is fragile, and the memory of past conflicts continues to fuel tensions. Curiosity about Balkan countries reveals a region where borders carry much more than lines on the map. These are borders marked by blood, historical disputes, and an incessant desire for identity and autonomy. Will the Balkans ever find true and lasting peace? Or will these borders continue to be a constant reminder of conflicts that never completely ended? The future of the region depends on how these nations deal with their internal divisions. Brexit, the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, has brought to light a series of complex questions about borders in Europe. The British decision to leave the European bloc triggered a reassessment of borders, especially in Northern Ireland, where the delicate balance of peace achieved with the Belfast Agreement was put to the test. The border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which was previously virtually invisible due to free movement promoted by the European Union, has now become a point of tension, posing a dilemma not just for the United Kingdom, but for the whole of Europe. The impact of Brexit on European borders goes far beyond Ireland. The UK's departure opened up the possibility that other countries will reconsider their place in the bloc, questioning the viability of open borders and the free movement of people and goods. The return to stricter borders, even though it is a distant reality for many countries, is a growing concern in times of economic and political crises. The Brexit puzzle, therefore, is not limited to the separation between the United Kingdom and the European Union, but reflects a larger question about the future of European borders. The Northern Ireland border is, however, the biggest point of controversy. The reintroduction of border controls could threaten peace in the region, where Catholics and Protestants have lived in a fragile peace since the end of hostilities in the 1990s. The European Union and the United Kingdom are seeking solutions that avoid the return of a physical border. But politics, commercial interests, and national identity create a scenario of uncertainty that has not yet been resolved. The future of this frontier could very well shape the destiny of Europe itself. Curiosity about countries like the United Kingdom and Ireland leads us to reflect on the impact of political decisions on borders. How will Brexit redefine the map of Europe, and will these open borders, which so symbolize European unity, survive? The Brexit puzzle is one of modern Europe's biggest geopolitical challenges, and its repercussions will be felt for years to come. The COVID-19 pandemic has transformed the way the world views and deals with borders. Suddenly, borders that were once permeable and open were closed in a desperate effort to contain the spread of the virus. Global mobility, something many took for granted, was abruptly halted, and national borders became lines of defense against an invisible threat. This new reality forced countries to rethink the concept of borders in a globalized world, where the movement of people and goods is essential for the functioning of modern economies. Border closures during the pandemic have not only disrupted trade and tourism, but also generated humanitarian crises. Thousands of people were trapped across borders, unable to return to their homes, and many migrant workers lost their jobs and livelihoods. Travel restrictions, essential to controlling the spread of the virus, have raised questions about human rights, immigration, and the vulnerability of the most marginalized. The pandemic has shown how borders can be at the same time protection and prison. The economic impact of these restrictions was equally devastating. companies that depended on the global supply chain faced serious difficulties, while sectors such as tourism and aviation suffered unprecedented losses. The interdependence between nations was painfully highlighted as border closures affected production, consumption, and even access to vaccines and medicines. The world suddenly found itself faced with borders that, although previously just lines on a map, became concrete barriers that altered the course of the global economy. Curiosity about how countries dealt with their borders during the pandemic makes us reflect on the fragility of global interconnections. How can borders be adapted in a world where threats can easily cross them? And what does the future hold for global mobility in a post-pandemic scenario? The answers to these questions will shape how the world deals with borders and global security for decades to come. The United Nations, UN, has played a central role in mediating and resolving border conflicts around the world. Since its founding, the UN has worked to prevent territorial disputes from escalating into open wars, using diplomatic dialogue, sending peacekeepers, and promoting international agreements. However, the task of maintaining peace and stabilizing borders in conflict zones is extremely complex, especially when world powers with their own interests come into play. World powers such as the United States, Russia, and China often shape global borders through treaties and interventions, whether directly or indirectly. These countries have strategic interests in various parts of the world, which often results in interference that can either stabilize or destabilize entire regions. In the Middle East, for example, the intervention of foreign powers has shaped modern borders, while in Africa, borders drawn during colonialism continue to generate conflicts that the UN tries to manage. The role of the UN is often challenged by the power politics of the most influential nations. In many cases, the national interests of these powers conflict with the peace efforts of the United Nations, making dispute resolution difficult. However, the UN still represents hope for many smaller nations that depend on its support to ensure their sovereignty and stability. International diplomacy, when successful, can transform regions of tension into areas of cooperation, but the path to this is always long and uncertain. Curiosity about how countries and international organizations influence global borders makes us question, what is the future of borders in a world where the interests of global powers often override the desire for peace? How can the UN continue to play its role in an increasingly complex scenario? The balance between diplomacy and power will be crucial in shaping the borders of the future. In the Internet age, virtual borders have become as important as physical ones. The digital world, which once seemed like a space free from geographic limitations, is now a battlefield where nations, companies, and even individuals vie for power and control. The rise of cyber wars and digital attacks has changed the concept of sovereignty, where countries can be invaded not by armies, but by hackers crossing invisible borders. Conflict in the digital world redefines notions of security and borders, creating a new and highly volatile scenario. Cyber attacks have already shown their ability to destabilize nations. Governments, infrastructure, and financial systems were targets of attacks that paralyzed entire countries. Nations such as the United States, Russia, and China are the main protagonists in this new war, where technological dominance has become one of the main focuses of dispute. The power to control networks, systems, and data goes beyond physical barriers, and the impact of a cyber attack can be as devastating as a conventional military attack. In addition to conflicts between countries, virtual borders are also being shaped by private companies that have control over vast digital territories. Social media platforms, internet providers, and technology giants have enormous influence on how information flows between nations. The laws that govern digital space are still in development, and the fight for control of this virtual territory is as intense as the fight for natural resources across physical borders. Data manipulation and information warfare are crucial parts of this new reality. Curiosity about how countries navigate this new world of virtual borders makes us reflect on the future of global security. How can nations protect their digital borders in such a dynamic and difficult-to-control environment? And will the digital world ever have rules and borders as clear as the physical ones? The answer to these questions will shape the future of nations and the concept of sovereignty itself in the 21st century. The future of borders is constantly changing, driven by emerging conflicts, disputes over resources, and the advance of globalization. In several parts of the world, new borders are being drawn, while old territorial disputes intensify. Conflict zones like the Middle East and Africa continue to suffer from unstable borders, but even relatively peaceful regions face challenges on the global stage. What does the future hold for borders in a world where territorial and economic disputes seem endless? Disputes over natural resources such as water, oil, and minerals play an increasingly central role in defining new frontiers. As these resources become scarce, nations seek to expand their zones of influence, which often leads to tensions and conflicts. The militarization of regions such as the Arctic and the increased presence of global powers in areas rich in natural resources indicate that future borders will be drawn both in the field of geopolitics and economics. Disputes over these riches will shape the global map in the coming decades. On the other hand, globalization challenges traditional borders, bringing a new reality to nations. Interconnected economies, mass migration, and the advancement of communication technologies are dissolving some physical barriers, while creating new cultural and economic barriers. Previously impenetrable borders are now easily crossed by capital and information, but at the same time, new forms of isolation and protectionism are emerging. The balance between openness and protection of borders will be one of the major issues of the future. Curiosity about how countries are dealing with these changes shows us that the borders of the future will not only be physical, but also political, economic, and virtual. How will these new borders shape relations between nations and the fate of the populations living near them? What will it take to ensure that these borders do not become new sources of conflict, but of cooperation? The world is at a crossroads, and the decisions made now will define the borders of tomorrow. As we look to the future, it is inevitable to ask ourselves, what awaits us in a world increasingly divided by borders? Lessons from the past show us that while borders can protect, they can also generate conflict and suffering. The reality is that borders, whether physical, political, or virtual, are reflections of human tensions. As long as there are disputes over power, resources, and identity, these invisible lines will continue to shape the history of the world. However, what we have learned along this journey is that the fate of the borders is not completely sealed. The future depends on the choices we make now, on the ability of nations to overcome rivalries and pursue cooperation rather than conflict. In a world where curiosity about countries and their borders reveals stories of division and hope, it is crucial that everyone plays their role in promoting peace and understanding. Borders will always exist, but what they represent can change. Can we imagine a world where borders are more about collaboration than separation? Where do nations find ways to coexist, respecting differences and working together to solve global challenges? What awaits us depends on how we face these issues today.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop. We're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.